long before our modern world ever existed. In an age carved into stone and sand, a young girl named Nefitari found herself standing in the courtyard of the great Temple of Amun at Karnak. She was only 9 years old, yet her small body trembled like someone carrying a weight far older than herself. Around her, a circle of priests moved with ritual precision, their bronze razors flashing beneath the unforgiving sun as they shaved her head, slowly, methodically, until not a single strand of childhood remained. Her father, a low-ranking official with his back against a wall he could no longer climb, had brought her to the temple just 3 days earlier. There was a debt he couldn't repay in silver, grain, or favor, so he paid it in the only currency he had left, his own daughter. And let me ask you, what would you have done in his place? It's a harsh question, but history forces us to face uncomfortable truths. Nefitari didn't truly understand what was happening. Her father told her this was an immense honor, that serving the gods was something to be proud of, something noble. But the moment that razor scraped across her scalp, tearing away the long black braids she once loved, the truth began to sink in. She started to weep. An elder priestess immediately slapped her across the cheek. "Servants of the god do not cry," she snapped. "You have no tears now, no name. You belong to Ammonius, and Ammonius does not tolerate weakness." That single moment marked the beginning of Nefitari's new existence. A life that would stretch on for 43 years, defined by confinement, obedience, and a quiet kind of suffering carefully hidden behind painted walls and sacred rituals. She would never again step outside the temple, never marry, never own anything, not even the smallest decision about her own body or future. And here is the part most people never hear. Nefitari was not an exception. She was one of thousands, girls and women who lived, worked, and died inside Egypt's temple complexes, clothed in the illusion of purity, while trapped in a system built on lifelong servitude. Their titles sounded elegant, even divine: wife of the god, hand of the goddess, servant of the divine, the pure one. But behind those beautiful names lurked a structure designed to strip away autonomy, identity, and humanity. This is the story the hieroglyphs are too polite to tell. And what follows isn't myth. It's attested in papyri, temple registers, and ancient administrative records. This is how religious authority can be twisted, weaponized to control the vulnerable. And if you want to continue uncovering the darkest, most hidden corners of human history, help this channel grow. Like the video, subscribe, because what comes next is far darker than anything you've imagined. The truth behind Egypt's temple women. When modern listeners hear temple virgins or priestesses of Egypt, they picture something graceful and dignified. Women in white linen performing sacred rituals, moving like living statues of holiness. But that image is a fantasy, one crafted by ancient propaganda and repeated until it became accepted truth. Let's peel that illusion apart. The most common Egyptian term was Hemet, wife of the god, or servant of the god. There were other designations, too. Shmait, a singer or musician of the temple. Kenrit, an attendant, a broad title covering many tasks. Each sounded respectable, but all of them shared a single reality. These women belonged to the temple, bound by rules that dictated every movement, every breath, every part of their existence. Their bodies were managed, their lives curated, their identity erased, and the word virgin didn't mean sexual innocence the way we think of it today. In temple language, purity meant ritual cleanliness, defined entirely by priests. Purity meant being untouched by the profane, but in practice, it meant the priests controlled every aspect of the woman's body. They determined what she could eat, who she could speak to, where she could go, and who could touch her. The women were kept pure for the gods, which, in real-world terms, meant kept available for the men who claimed to speak for those gods. Here is the most heartbreaking truth. Very few of these women ever chose this life. Many were offered to the temple when they were far too young to comprehend what was happening. Families dedicated their daughters as offerings, sometimes hoping for divine blessings, more often simply because feeding fewer mouths meant survival. What was framed as piety was, in reality, permanent abandonment. Once a girl crossed the temple threshold, she didn't come back. Others were surrendered as payment, just like Nefitari. Temples weren't just religious sanctuaries. They were economic powerhouses, controlling land, money, grain stores, and taxation. When a family couldn't repay a temple loan, the debt collectors came, and daughters were currency. It was state-approved human trafficking wrapped in holy language. And then there were the girls who had nobody to defend them, the ones taken as tribute. Egyptian armies raided Nubia, Libya, and the Levant regularly. Among the gold, grain, and cattle, they also seized children, girls, some as young as 8. They were delivered straight to temple officials, absorbed into a system where escape did not exist. Records on ancient papyri confirm that many initiates entered service at 8 or 9 years old, sometimes younger. Children who could not possibly consent. One of them was a girl named Matmoya. She was only 8 when Egyptian soldiers entered her Nubian village collecting tribute. Ivory, livestock, and children. Matmoya was bound with 12 others, tied by rope, and marched hundreds of kilometers north. She didn't understand their language. She had no idea where she was being taken. Her crying didn't stop until a guard hit her and ordered her silence. From that moment forward, she learned to cry quietly. When she finally reached Thebes, she was delivered to the Temple of Mut, goddess of motherhood. A bitter irony the child could not yet comprehend. She would serve a goddess of mothers while being denied the right to ever become one herself. The breaking of the self. The transformation of children like Nefitari and Matmoya into temple property wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The rituals they endured were specifically crafted to dismantle them psychologically and emotionally, piece by piece. The first step was purification by water. The child was led to a sacred pool, ordered to undress, and repeatedly washed with water mixed with natron, the same compound used in mummification. Officially, it symbolized cleansing. In reality, it was an invasive, ritualized inspection disguised as holiness. Priests examined every part of the girl's body under the sacred excuse of ensuring purity. They warned that resistance would anger the gods. When Nefitari was taken to the stone pool, 3 priests and 2 elder women waited. She hesitated, clutching her clothes. One of the women seized her and ripped them away. The water was ice cold. A priest stepped into the pool beside her and ordered her to stand still. Slowly, methodically, he began touching her in ways that made her tremble with fear. When she pulled away, he grabbed her arm and hissed, "The gods are watching. They test your obedience." Frozen with terror, she endured in silence. That moment, disguised as sacred duty, was her first violation. And it taught her instantly, her body was no longer hers. After purification came the shaving ritual. Every strand of hair was removed. Officially, it promoted ritual cleanliness. But its true purpose was far darker. It stripped the girl's identity, erasing the last pieces of who she once was. Hair in the ancient world wasn't just hair. It was identity, beauty, pride, and the last piece of the self a girl could truly call her own. So when the temple scraped every strand from Nefitari's head, it wasn't grooming. It was erasure. When she stared into a polished bronze mirror afterward, the face staring back didn't feel familiar. The child named Nefitari, the girl her mother once held, was gone. In her place stood the temple's creation, a figure molded for obedience. The next step sealed that transformation. Her name, the one whispered to her at birth, was stripped away. The priests replaced it with something ceremonial, something they could control. Names like Beloved of Ammonius or Hand of the Goddess. Nefitari herself was renamed Nefert-Nebet. Beautiful is the lady, and she was commanded never to utter her true name again. That name and the life tied to it were declared dead. From that moment forward, she was no longer anyone's daughter. She was a living offering, property of the gods. But the rituals didn't end with cleansing, shaving, or renaming. Those were only preparation. The final step was the darkest one, the ritual the priests called the divine marriage. The temples portrayed it as the highest honor imaginable. A sacred union, a spiritual elevation, But underneath the holy phrases, it was nothing short of a lifetime contract of ownership. Dressed in pure white linen, her bare scalp hidden under a heavy ceremonial wig, the child was covered in beads and gold. She was led into the dim sanctuary, placed before the colossal statue of the deity she was destined to serve forever. Priests chanted oaths as though the god itself were speaking through them, accepting the girl as a divine bride. When Muya's turn came, she was only 10 years old. Her small frame wrapped in shimmering linen, her neck weighed down by gold, she stepped into the candlelit chamber of the goddess Mut. The high priest began chanting in the ancient tongue, claiming the goddess had chosen Muya personally. He forced her to repeat the vows. I take the vows. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. The moment she echoed those words, she was bound to the temple for life. In the archives, it was recorded as a sacred union. But everyone inside the system knew what it truly meant. A girl married to a god could never marry a man. She could bear no legitimate children. She could never leave. And the darker implication was this: if priests acted as the god's representatives, then they believed they held access to the god's wife. That twisted logic comes later. But first, you have to understand the life these girls were forced to live. Life inside the temple was engineered with precision, a machine built to produce obedience. Nefertnebet, once Nefitari, began her days long before sunrise, waking in a crowded dormitory filled with girls who had forgotten what freedom even meant. Privacy wasn't just rare, it didn't exist at all. Mornings started with ritual washings. Then they slipped into plain white linen robes. Not clothing, but uniforms that declared them temple property. After that came their daily labor, a grinding grain until their hands bled, a weaving endless lengths of linen for temple use, cleaning shrines in silent, repetitive cycles. The repetition wasn't accidental. It broke the mind. But the silence, that was the real weapon. They were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Any unnecessary word was treated as rebellion. Nefert's only companionship came from a girl named Takayat. They worked side by side at the looms and occasionally whispered to keep from losing their sanity. One day, the overseer noticed. Without warning, she struck Takayat hard across the neck with a wooden rod. Takayat was dragged outside as the supervisor shouted for all to hear. This is the punishment for those who violate the silence. For 3 days, Takayat disappeared. When she returned, she didn't speak, not even in whispers. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out. 2 months later, she vanished completely. The overseer simply announced, Takayat was found impure and returned to the gods. Everyone knew what that meant. No one dared ask. Surveillance inside the temple was relentless. Every movement monitored. Every connection severed. Letters to families were forbidden. Visits were not allowed. The temple sealed these women off from the world like they were sacred prisoners. And then came the purity inspections, ritual examinations carried out by priests, violations disguised as worship. Nefert learned the only way to survive was to detach her mind from her body, floating somewhere else while the ritual purity checks were performed. If she resisted, if she cried, if she showed even a flicker of discomfort, she was punished, beaten, starved, or worked to exhaustion. Escape wasn't just impossible, it was unthinkable. Most had been taken so young they barely remembered life outside the stone walls. They had no skills, no family, no identity except what the temple had forced upon them. Their education inside the temple reinforced this programming. Priests told them, "You are blessed. You are chosen. Your body is a temple. We speak with the authority of the gods." It sounded holy until you realized how that belief was weaponized. Because if your body is a temple, and priests are the mouthpieces of the gods, then the priests claimed access to that temple. When Mutamuya, the young Nubian girl, turned 16, she had already spent half her life behind the temple walls. Yet she still clung to a few fading memories. Her mother's voice, her village songs. One night she hummed a soft Nubian melody under her breath. A small act of humanity. a memory trying to survive. An older woman heard her and immediately reported her. The next morning, Muya was dragged before the high priest. He struck her across the face. "You have no mother," he said. "You have no language but the language of the gods. You have no memories except the ones we permit." She was locked alone in a storeroom for 7 days. When she finally emerged, the last trace of who she had once been was gone. She never sang again. And now, we reach the darkest part of their lives, the role of women known as wives of the god, and the rituals called sacred unions, ceremonies supposedly meant to reenact divine myths and ensure Egypt's fertility. But the truth behind those rituals is far more horrifying. The ancient inscriptions describing these unions read like poetry, drenched in symbolism, divine metaphors, and flowery religious imagery. But behind that decorated language lurked something far more sinister. High-ranking priests, especially the chief priest of Ammonius, claimed that during these ceremonies they weren't merely men, but literal vessels of the god. They wrapped themselves in ornate divine robes, performed elaborate rites, and proclaimed that whatever they did was the god acting through their bodies. The women chosen for these rituals were told they were about to receive a divine blessing. They were led into sealed inner sanctuaries, warned that resistance meant provoking the anger of the gods, that defiance could bring disaster upon Egypt itself. And then the priests enacted what they dared to call the gods' sacred marriage. Let's speak plainly. There was nothing holy about these unions. They were acts of coercion, encounters in which powerful men exploited girls who had been conditioned since childhood to believe their bodies belonged entirely to the gods. When Nefitari was chosen for her first sacred union, she was only 14. They told her the god Ammonius had chosen her personally. On the night of the ritual, she was taken into the deepest chamber of the temple. Incense choked the air. The high priest stepped forward, his real face hidden beneath a glittering ceremonial mask, and commanded her to surrender completely. Nefitari didn't understand, not until his hands reached for her garments. Instinct made her step back, but the other priests whispered that resisting was an insult to the god. The high priest warned her that refusal would be blasphemy of the highest order. Later, the ritual would be proudly recorded as a successful sacred union. But Nefitari knew the truth. There was nothing sacred in what had happened. It was a violation, ritualized assault dressed up as holiness. Some women endured these so-called divine unions again and again. Even worse, many became pregnant. Their children were labeled blessed in official records. Yet their existence silently exposed the reality the temple tried to hide. Daughters were raised to become temple servants like their mothers. Sons were taken by priests to be molded into future priests themselves. The cycle fed itself. At 16, Nefitari discovered she was pregnant. She was moved to a secluded wing where other expectant women lived, all victims of the same system. One older woman whispered to her, "Do not hope too much. Once your baby no longer needs milk, they will take it. If it's a girl, she will serve here. If it's a boy, the priests will claim him. You will remain temple property, and so will your child." Nefitari eventually gave birth to a daughter. For 3 short years, she held her, fed her, watched her grow. Then the child was taken away to begin temple training. Nefitari returned to her duties, seeing her daughter only from a distance in the corridors. Forbidden to speak to her, forbidden even to acknowledge she existed. Watching her little girl endure the same breaking process she had once suffered was the most brutal punishment of all. And the fate of those who dared to resist was engineered to terrify every witness. Some women suffered what the records coldly call dedication to the desert. They were dragged beyond the walls, thrown into the scorching sun with no food and no water, left to die slowly under the blazing sky. A death of agony. One woman named Renutma reached her breaking point. During a midday meal, she suddenly stood and shouted, "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners." The entire hall froze. Renutma was seized at once and carried outside. Every woman in the temple was forced to watch as she was marched into the desert and abandoned to the burning sand. The next morning, the temple women were taken to see what was left of her body. already partially eaten by wild animals. The high priest declared, "This is the destiny of the impure." But Renutma left behind another kind of legacy, a message etched deeper than fear. Her defiance taught the others that resistance had to move underground, silent and invisible. Rebellion lived on in secret songs with hidden meanings, in fleeting glances exchanged during prayer, in tiny mistakes woven intentionally into linen, faint patterns spelling out phrases like, "I resist." Most temple women died within those walls. They spent their entire lives serving an institution that took everything from them. When they collapsed at last, they were buried in unmarked pits, their names stripped away like they had never existed. When Nefitari died at 52, her body was placed in a mass grave with 3 others. No coffin, no rites, no mourning. Her daughter, now grown and trapped in the same system, was forbidden to grieve. The order was absolute. Forget she ever lived. But some of these women refused to vanish completely. In hidden corners, carved into stone fragments, they left messages, final acts of defiance. "I was born free. They took that from me. Remember that we were people." And then there was Mutamuya, the Nubian girl who never let go of her memories. 2 days before she died, she scratched her final words into the dark wall of a storage chamber. "I came from beyond the first waterfall. My mother's name was Manitori. I remember her voice. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived. Know that I remembered." Her words still whisper from the stone. "I existed. I mattered. Remember me." This is the truth Egyptian temples tried hardest to bury. Thousands of girls taken as children, used for decades, and erased in death. Today, thousands of tourists walk through those ancient temples in awe, admiring the colossal pillars, the vivid murals, the grand design crafted for kings and gods. But very few ever pause long enough to imagine the suffering that once unfolded behind those same stones. But you know now, and once you know, you can't unsee it. Behind those carved deities and royal inscriptions lived real women. Women like Nefitari, Mutamuya, and countless others whose stories were buried beneath layers of myth, power, and silence. They weren't symbols. They weren't footnotes. They were human beings who endured unspeakable cruelty, and yet, in their final moments, still found ways to leave their mark. Sometimes with words, sometimes with a hidden carving, sometimes with nothing more than a desperate scratch against stone. A testament that they lived, suffered, and mattered. So let me ask you, how should history remember these monuments of oppression? What do you think their story teaches us today, in a world still struggling with power, dignity, and justice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive. And if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, if you believe history's silent stories should finally be told, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Here, we bring you the truths that official records tried to bury. The stories carved into stone, waiting for someone willing to look deeper. The temples still stand. The stones still remember. And now, so do you.